So what I wanted to do was share with you some work and some ideas that we've been working on with regard to post-stroke aphasia. Or I think it hopefully is very applicable to a wide variety of other disorders. And this is work with my good colleagues AJ Halai, Anna Willems, and other people. So as we all know, one of the great things from 19th century behavioral neurology was thinking about not only the nature but also the neural bases of aphasia. And really, even at the beginning, those great behavioral neurologists, particularly from this country, were already thinking about not only were there important relationships between the location of the damage, but also disconnections between different regions. And arguably, some of the first examples of what we now know as disconnection syndromes were coming out of the studies of patients with language impairment. And obviously, aphasia is a very common neurological disorder, so at least 1/3 of patients post-stroke will have some kind of language impairment. Around 20% will have it in the chronic phase. The other things that the early behavioral neurologists already noted was, although we use the word aphasia sometimes as some monolithic entity, there's clearly many different contrastive types of language problem. And we see those, and they all get called different things, and we'd see them in the clinic. So we would say people have language problems, but from one patient to another, you'll see very different kinds of behavioral presentation in the clinic. And so the classical way of thinking about this, which still sort of resonates now in lots of practice, is to think about different types of category of language problems. So we might say somebody would have some form of Broca's aphasia or Wernicke's aphasia or conduction and so on. And following those original studies and the more contemporary ones, obviously people then created diagnostic clinical tools for placing patients into these categories. So we would then have the Boston Diagnostic, the Aachen aphasia test, the WAB, all the different ones around the world. So one of the key sort of broader issues that I wanted to talk about today is there's clearly, though, some problems with this way of thinking about things. And anyone who sees these sorts of patients in the clinic will hopefully resonate with some of these ideas. So some of the key issues are pretty straightforward. The first is that in one category, let's say in Wernicke's aphasia, there'll be a lot of variation of the types of patients in that category. So if you think about patients who you might say, okay, there are some form of Wernicke's aphasia, there's a huge variation within the category. There's also an extremely fuzzy boundary between the categories. So sometimes it's very difficult to know whether somebody's really a conduction aphasic on when they become a Wernicke's aphasic or when they become a nomic. And in fact, in the clinic, probably the bulk of the people one would see end up being called mixed aphasic, which is just a euphemism for we can't give them a category. And they're a substantial number of the patients. So I think one way of thinking about this as an analogy is to think about colors and color labels. So this diagram might be familiar to you if you use PowerPoints. This is the PowerPoint color selection chart when you're picking your pretty pictures for your PowerPoint slides. So we might say, okay, there's an area here, and we're going to use the label blue, and a different area here, which we'll call yellow. Clearly, yellow places and blue places, like patient types, very different. And so the label is quite helpful in saying, okay, there's an area I'm going to call blue and an area I'm going to call yellow. They're not the same area. And you can think of the same thing in a minute for aphasias. Of course, the issue is that, in fact, in a category like the category of blue, there's various different forms of blue. And that gives us some interestingness in the sense of there's lots of areas that are called blue. The same is true for the yellow areas. And it's very difficult to know where the boundaries are. So if we just now convert this into the aphasia type, so we might have Broca's aphasia being yellow, Wernicke's and so on, the middle being the mildest, so that'll be anomic. And now we have the variations. What we have is there's many different kinds of Wernicke's aphasia, anomia aphasia, but also it's not very clear where these boundaries are. So the key hypothesis is that rather than thinking of discrete categories, maybe we need to start thinking in a different way. Then maybe we need to start thinking more in terms of dimensions. So there's two elements to this new hypothesis that we can think about. So one is that the true nature of the patients clinically and the underlying neural systems are, in fact, multiple continuous behavioral dimensions. They're not categories. And then relating the behavior to the behavioral neurology, we need to move away from thinking about categories and actually, discovering what the dimensions are, and then relate the dimensions to the brain. So in terms of how this links with network models, thanks to the modern forms of tractography, we're now getting a much more sophisticated sense of the white matter tracks that underlie language performance. So this was an early study that we did in Manchester, and then Dorothy Sauer's very famous, beautiful study in PNAS. And what you can see is here what is now known as the dorsal and ventral language pathways. So the dorsal pathway seeming to be very important for the formation and representation of the sound structure of words. And the ventral pathway being important for interaction with the meaning of words, and arguably the anterior temporal lobe, which is other work that we do, in the representation of meaning. Now notice here we're not talking about certain language activities being in certain brain parts. We're talking about core representations that will get used in different ways across different activities. So in speaking, we'll need both the meaning and the sound structure of words. So these areas have to work together and generate and through a network. So they're not one pathway for naming, one pathway for repetition, one pathway for comprehension. They're actually supporting primary dimensions of representation, which are used, so one could use an analogy of cooking. These are like ingredients, and each activity is like the product of whatever you're going to cook. And in a series of computational models over the years, this being the most recent for language, we took these new architectural models still in a relatively simple state and generated, these are computational models that actually generate language. So this is the sort of proxy to the auditory input of speech. This actually speaks Japanese. So it takes words in syllable by syllable and represents them here and has to do three things with that input. One is it has to repeat, has to learn to repeat. So it has to take all the sound in, not say anything while multisyllabic words are input. And then it has to generate the inputs. It has to generate those as output, having weighted. So it has to repeat. It also has to take the input and turn on a stable semantic representation, which is forced into the model here in terms of the output layer. It also has to learn to speak from meaning, so simple speech production. So it has to take the meaning as input and generate a continuous speech output. So computationally, there's some challenges here. So one is for repetition, it has to store and hold on to the inputs over time before it can generate the outputs, which are also time varying. So some of the pathways allow you to buffer the information. It also has to transform time varying inputs into a static time invariant meaning. And it has to do the reverse mapping. So take a very invariant input and generate a time-varying output. So The crucial thing about this model is that the pathways are clearly mimicking what we know is true in the brain. Undoubtedly, this is going to become more sophisticated as we learn more about the wiring of the language system, but this is a good first proxy. All of the only regions that are fixed by the experimenter are those three layers. All the other connections, to go back to John's talk previously, these are learned through experience-dependent learning in this kind of framework. So there are weights that are already there. There's possible connections there, but the strength of them is moderated by the language learning process. That's true both in development and also after we simulate different kinds of damage. And to give you a quick summary, what happens in this model is as it's learning, there's a division of labor that occurs such that the dorsal pathway, because it's interested in the time-varying structure, picks up the phonological structure of the language, in this case Japanese, but it could be English or German or any other language you like. And then the dorsal pathway, because it has to project in and out of meaning, becomes much more important for discovering the mappings to and from word meanings. But any one particular activity like naming or comprehension will be some combination of these two major pathways. And what we showed in this model was the model can learn, it can learn to do the different tasks. Importantly, it can learn to repeat completely novel forms. So we can all repeat words in our non-native language or made-up words, which turns out to be computationally extremely tricky to get right. But this framework, and not other frameworks, allow you to do that. You have to have this separation of the pathways. And from my point of view, because I see aphasic patients in the clinic and try and think about different forms of intervention for them, when we damage these different parts of the model, we can generate all the different kinds of language problems. So if you damage the dorsal pathway, you have a phonologically related disorder. If you damage the ventral pathway, you have a more semantically related disorder. Interestingly, from just to relate it back to John's previous study, this model can't grow new brain areas to form recovery. It has to use what's remaining once you've damaged it. So this model is a learning-dependent model that uses a gradual error reduction algorithms to reset the weights. So that's what it does during development. And we can also do the same thing for simulating recovery. So you can take, let's say, damage in the dorsal pathway. The model becomes kind of a conduction aphasia with repetition problems. Allow it to recover, and what it does is it doesn't grow a magic new region, but it uses any remaining connectivity in this pathway, plus it changes the division of labor. So it starts to try to use the semantic pathway in repetition. It can do that to some degree, but it can only do it for items that have meaning. So it can only recover some of the repetition with respect to semantics. So this kind of framework is obviously a theoretical framework. We can capture a lot of the patient data, but what about, can we start relating this back to this notion of dimensions and moving away from categories? So the model would give us this different way of projecting patients. So rather than being categories that are separated and distinct, we would start to place them in this sort of continuous dimension. So here are only two to start with. So good versus bad semantic abilities, which we would sort of associate with some of these ventral areas, and good versus bad phonological skills, which in the aphasic population is going to be the primary dimension plus some others. And so we start thinking about that our mildest patients and the ones with the best recovery are the anomic aphasics. So in comparison to everyone else, they have only mild phonological problems and mild semantic problems. Classical conduction aphasics, so those that have poor repetition, poor phonological skills and representations, but relatively good comprehension, would then, of course, sit in this part of the space. Transcortical sensory will be the direct opposite to that. And then the poor globals, of course, are terrible at everything. Notice the crucial thing about the coloring is that there's no absolute boundary here. We're just talking about these labels cover a certain aspect of the space. So how can we actually move this towards some empirical data? So over the recent years, we've been building up and continuing to build a database of these are all chronic aphasics, post-stroke, so they have to all be at least 1 year post-onset. We've deliberately picked the full range of patients. So anyone who's willing to take part, they can have any level of aphasia, any type of aphasia. They all have to have a single stroke so we can be more certain about the lesion correlates. They obviously have to be able to get into the MR, which isn't going to be true for everyone. And to date, we've now got a completion of 75 cases. The reason we've got 75 and not 750 is that they do 2 lots of things with us. They come for relatively detailed scanning in one session. So they have T1s, they have 43 direction diffusion imaging with distortion correction because we want to see the anterior temporal lobe, which is very affected by the distortion problems. The first set, they had arterial spin labeling, and now we've moved to the resting state. To have a look at some of the things that John was talking about, if one can actually make any sense of the resting state. The other thing we do is very detailed neuropsychology. So this is more than most people do, and I like to call it high-resolution neuropsychology and aphasiology. So they'll have roughly 4 sessions of detailed behavioral testing. They do around at least 30 different assessments covering all different aspects, not only of language and some of the classical categorization methods like the Boston diagnostic, all different forms of language, single words, and some sentence level things. But also, we're very interested in the status of their executive and attentional skills, so things beyond language. Commonly in the clinic, certainly in the UK, speech pathologists would not go and assess these things. Aphasics are only supposed to have language problems. In our experience, this is not true. There's various levels of co-occurring executive and attention function, and in separate work, we found that those are actually strongly predictive of therapy response, in addition to their degree of language impairment. So let's just go back. So this is what one would do if you're doing a Boston diagnostic. So you might decide, okay, is somebody fluent or non-fluent? Can they comprehend? Can they repeat? And then you pop them into one of these categories. If you do that and start looking at the lesion correlates, you get this kind of thing. So here's the anomic aphasics in our group, the Broca's aphasics, the mixed non-fluents. And their lesion overlaps are shown in these different colors. What I'm hoping you're thinking is, these are all looking extremely similar. Where's the difference? That's exactly what you're supposed to be thinking. With the eye of faith, perhaps we might say, oh, the anomics have a slightly smaller lesions, maybe not extending so frontally than the others. But basically, they're all overlapping. One could say, well, that's because a Boston diagnostic is completely useless. Let's actually do some proper testing. Let's take some individual tests. So let's take how good they are on the naming test, how good they are on a repetition test, how good are they at comprehension in a word-to-picture matching test. You can see you get exactly the same thing. We just keep getting the same region. And of course, that region's not a random region. It's the area of the MCA territory. And often, in lesion correlate studies, you'll see areas that are just obviously can only be in the area that causes aphasia, which is most commonly MCA stroke. So this is the lesion overlap for our patient group. And you can see in ours, we get the full extent of the core, not only the core perisylvian areas, but right out down into the medial temporal lobe and out into the other regions. We've also shown that it's quite important to think about lesion volume, because this is an analysis where you say, what's the likelihood that each voxel is damaged given the size of the lesion? And that's not a homogeneous form of prediction. What you actually find is that some areas, their status is correlated with the size of the lesion. And of course, in a neurology audience, I don't have to explain, it's going to be all the regions around the edge of the MCA territory. So both in the into the deeper white matter, the temporoparietal areas, and these frontal regions. So away from the typical lesion overlap areas into the areas for the broader lesions. So how do we move away from that? And how can we kind of escape the vortex and the black hole that's just the raw lesion? Well, this is where, hopefully, this is sort of an example of, if we think carefully about how to deal with the behavioral data before we try and relate it to the brains, we can start making some progress. So if we believe data was categorical, there are statistical methods for trying to discover categories in data. If we think that the data aren't categorical but are dimensions, there's a completely different set of statistical analyses, of which the sort of longest standing one, discovered and by mathematicians nearly 100 years ago, is principal component analysis. There are others, but principal components is the best known and relatively easy to do. So for those of you who don't know, this is a data reduction technique that can estimate the underlying continuous dimensions, so not only how many, but what are they. You can also rotate them, so this is just for the aficionados in the audience. We use varimax rotation, which from a behavioral neurology, neuropsychology point of view is important because we want to try and understand what the dimensions mean in terms of behavior. Standard plain principal component analysis just puts the dimensions in line with the variance. And that doesn't necessarily align it with easily cognitively interpretable data. If you turn them, you maintain the orthogonality, so the independence of the dimensions, but you can promote cognitive interpretability, and I'll show you in a second that for real. Also, it's interesting because it will decompose tasks. So when we do a task like naming, it's clearly measuring more than one thing. And again, I'll show you that's easier to see in an example. So in the first paper in Brain, which also had a news article in Nature Reviews Neurology when it came out, we took the first set of patients. Here's a set of tests that they'd all done. And here's the loadings. So just to give you a sense of what this means, these are just like correlations. So it just tells you how important is this task in these different factors. And so you can see we had 3. So the first one, which is really just to do with the phonological representations, all tasks like repetition, making phonological judgments, and naming all load into this factor. The second one is all of the semantically related tests, so naming and different forms of comprehension, both verbal and non-verbal. And then we also, interestingly, in an aphasic sample, had a third one, which is really the executive demand. So not only classical executive frontal tasks like the color progressive matrices, but also even language tasks where there's a very heavy decision component. So this is one of the semantic tasks, which is very requires very good problem solving, and also some of the phonological tasks where they're really very difficult and you have to be very careful about your decisions. These load very heavily into this executive factor. So what that means that we can do now is, rather than relating task to the brain, we can recalculate the patients in terms of their positions in these 3 dimensions. So we have semantics, phonology, and executive skill. And they're statistically orthogonal to each other. And you start to get maps like this. Now, this is exactly the same data I was showing you before, the same patients with all their overlapping MCA territory lesions and no differentiation amongst tasks or categories. But now look what we get. So by orthogonalizing and pulling out and decomposing the behavioral data, we suddenly start to see a much clearer pattern, and one which is starting to look reminiscent of some of the notions of both regions and these pathways for phonology. And this is for phonology and semantics. So for phonology, we get primary auditory areas areas in temporoparietal junction, and then round into the opercularis. So these, this analysis doesn't show you the connectivity, it's showing you the cortical regions. So these regions are all associated in functional imaging in healthy participants with phonological processing. So people like Greg Hickok and David Popple will have phonological representations, including all these areas and phonological output. And then interestingly, when we start to selectively pull out the dimension for semantic representation that's not accounted for by phonological ability or executive ability, we start seeing the anterior temporal lobe, which is the area posited in the model, but also from completely different patient groups. So from patients with semantic dementia, who are the temporal lobe variant of frontotemporal dementia, have a lot of damage in this region and have a selective semantic impairment. So interestingly, starts to create a link between the stroke data and other patient groups. Just to finish, I just want to give you a sense of then what else you can add in. Of course, as we know, if the first decision we often make in the clinic is this patient fluent or not? So we really wanted to add fluency into the model. And in the Boston, there's this now rather dated-looking, politically incorrect picture, which you ask people to describe. And you can take different measures of speech, whether that's the raw number of words, the mean length of utterance. Type token ratio means the number of different types of word divided by the raw number of total words, which gives you a sense of richness of the speech. And then again, another sort of measure of pure, simple fluency, so just the number of words generated in any 1 minute. This is now the same fractal analysis I showed you before, so we've got these 3 components. We're now going to put these measures in on top, and we get this. So the first thing to notice is that this principal component analysis, the model is stable. You can add patients, you can add different tasks, and all the original factors are still there. And this has been our experience over the years. It seems to be almost indestructible, and we've actually replicated, it's been replicated not only here in the acute patients, but in Philadelphia in a different sample. We add these different measures of speech in, and they split into 2 types. So one is this richness. The richness, so how many different kinds of words you can say given all the total words, actually just gets subsumed into semantics. So if you have a rich semantic knowledge left, you're going to generate very rich speech with a rich vocabulary. Then there's just simply the raw number of words you can still generate, which forms a new and 4th element here, which we called speech quanta, for want of a better term. We can now do the same mapping now of the dimensions into the space, and you can see we have our same regions as before. So temporal and posterior temporal parietal junction area for phonology, the anterior temporal lobe, particularly the white matter in the stem for semantics, but now we have a new area for the fluency, so pre-motor, but going deep into the white matter. And this is also interesting for thinking about networks, because Marco Catani and others have shown in various studies what some of the medium-range connections are in the frontal lobe in the human, and one's called this thing called the frontal ascending tract, which connects SMA down into prefrontal cortex. And what was pretty amazing, remember these again out of these overlapping MCA territory lesions, the green area is the area that's pulled out by our analysis, and see how closely it tracks, overlaps with the frontal ascending tract. So we haven't bound our lesion correlate of interest. This is what was produced by analysis, but see how closely it gets to this tract. So if you disconnect SMA from the premotor, the ventral frontal region, you become disfluent. And interestingly, again, there's convergent evidence for this. So Defoe and colleagues have directly stimulated this tract during surgery and causes a transient non-fluency, and in progressive aphasia, in the non-fluent progressive aphasics, their degree of non-fluency is correlated with the integrity of this tract. So just to summarize and finish, so some key ideas here are that the variation in the behavioral form, the phenotype of post-stroke aphasics, is there are many types, and they're separable, but they're continuous. They're not categorical. And it may be better if we start moving away from categories into thinking about patients taking up different parts of a multidimensional space. And then having discovered these dimensions, and then there's ways of trying to discover these dimensions, we can then relate those to now much more unique areas of lesioning, which is not just simply a reflection of the MCA territory. And I haven't shown you, but in fact, all of the results I've shown you survive when you put lesion size, age, other covariates in. And I think hopefully this is of interest not only in aphasia, but also we could start thinking about using this in other forms of higher cognitive disorders where, again, classically we would start to think about categories, but are really much more to do with continuous things. Future work is obvious, so we can use the multimodal imaging to try and improve the predictions and generate prediction models. Reverse the relationship, take the lesions and start to predict performance, which from a clinical point of view would be great because we could, the scans will settle relatively quickly post-stroke, but the behavior doesn't. It takes months before the final form of the aphasia is settled, but maybe we could use this to be predictive with some degree of accuracy of what someone's going to be like in the end. Thanks very much.